I can guarantee
Okay,
you're not the oldest young professional in the group.
Okay, thank you all for joining. We're really glad that you found time between your other Zoom meetings to join our Zoom meeting and feel young at heart and being a professional. So today we will hear about the 2035 report that was released several months ago, and it shows how recent cost declines for solar, wind, and battery storage can allow the US to reach 90% clean electricity by 2035. And we will hear from Taylor McNair, a program manager at GridLab. Taylor is responsible for GridLab's communication and project management efforts, operations, and administration, and he graduated from Emory University Gazette Business School and a double major in environmental sciences. Amol Patke is a senior scientist at UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy, and his work is focused on grid-scale battery storage, heavy-duty EVs, renewable energy in the India power sector, and appliance and equipment efficiency in several emerging economies. Amol has the PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley. Please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Jenya. Thanks for organizing this and thanks for having us. We're really excited to talk about this report as we've been doing for the past few months. So we're eager to hear your questions and any conversation afterwards. So as Jenya mentioned, my name is Taylor McNair. I'm the program manager at GridLab. We are a small nonprofit here in the Bay Area that exists to provide technical support on energy and grid issues, like the ones that we'll talk about today. And we were one of the co-authors and organizers for the 2035 report, which is what we'll be talking about today. So along with GridLab, this project was largely produced by the Goldman School of Public Policy, and specifically Amol's team, who did most of the modeling and technical analysis behind the report. We were also supported by Climate Nexus, which is a climate communications firm, as well as Energy Innovation, which is a think tank here in the Bay Area that provided an additional supporting policy paper that was released as an accompaniment to this particular report. So I'm gonna just tee it off real quickly, just talk about a little bit of the impetus for the study, and then I'll pass it over to Amol, who will sort of dive into the details and some of our modeling results and what those implications are for the energy grid. So why 90% clean energy by 2035? Really what this report is premised on is the fact that it is both technically and economically feasible for the US to achieve 90% clean electricity by 2035, all at costs that are the same or lower than we are paying today. That premise is really underlined by the fact that wind, solar, and storage are some of the cheapest forms of electricity generation in the country. And in particular, we think that this is really the first study to show that wind, solar, and storage prices have decreased so dramatically over the past few years and are continuing to decrease so dramatically that we can deliver these large emissions reductions in the power sector. So, we really chose to focus on the power sector in this report because the electric sector is sort of a key contributor of greenhouse gases in the country, but also a key linchpin on which the rest of the economy will decarbonize. So we know that in order for us to achieve our economy-wide and even global decarbonization goals, we need to first cut carbon emissions from the power sector over the next 10 to 15 years, while at the same time beginning to draw down carbon emissions from the buildings, the transport, the industrial, and the agricultural sectors, which in many cases we can electrify and plug into this newly decarbonized power grid. So we know that this, as we're going to talk about over the next 15, 20, 30 minutes, we know that this build out of renewables over the next 15 years is feasible and cost effective. And we know that it delivers massive economic, health, and climate benefits and employment benefits throughout the country. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Amol, and we can dive into some more of the more detailed results of this report. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the policy implications and recommendations that we have.
All right, thanks, Taylor, and thanks, folks, for inviting us. Super excited to be here. At least I can present to the young professionals. So I think the one key aspect of why we focused on 2035 is at times the 2050 targets act as greenwashing, meaning that if you do a 2050 target and still continue to build fossil power plants and do nothing in the intermediate term, it actually may be detrimental to climate progress. So it's very important to look at intermediate targets which actually affect investment decisions today or which are underway. The other reason we did kind of focus on the 90% is that we wanted to be, there's a lot of academic discussion on the last 10%, like what about like firm low carbon resources, and that is admirable. And I joke that, it's like I talking about how would I get a six-pack on my 50th birthday. I mean, it's a nice goal, but I think we should think about how fast we can move given what has happened to keep commercially available technology today. So that's kind of the motivation in addition to what Taylor just said of why we did it. So I love this figure, not because we made it, but it just shows how fast the technology has moved. And everybody here knows how fast the solar and storage costs have come down. But what's interesting here is that how much the projections also have changed. So if you look at NREL's annual technology baseline projections in 2016, which is not that far, was not that far before, whatever cost reductions were projected to realize by 2030 are already here. So just so the point of this figure is that not only the costs have dropped, the cost projections just a few years ago, which were saying what the cost would be in 2030, are already here. So our hypothesis is that if the cost reductions have arrived 15 years or 10 to 15 years faster than what we just projected a few years ago, why not look at a more aggressive 2035 target? Next slide. So we essentially looked at in terms of the cost assumptions, we basically use the NREL ATB 2019 cost projections as our baseline. And as you can see in this figure shows the historical cost reductions and the future cost projections we used in our report. The point being the conclusions of our report, which you will see very soon, don't rely on very dramatic future cost reductions because they are not really in the NREL projections. And what's interesting is that we basically use the NREL ATB mid case as our baseline projection, except with one modification that we use the low case in the initial period until 2021, because given the PPA prices, we believe that the cost projections are actually following the low projection trajectory, so those cost reductions are kind of baked in. But for the future, we want it to be modest and conservative, so we use like a mid-case scenario. Next slide. In terms of our modeling, we use pretty industry standard tools. We use NREL's READS model for capacity expansion, which they have made it public, so anybody can download and use it. But to actually check the operational feasibility of a 90% clean system, we simulated the power system in Plexos for like 134 zones in the US, modeled constraints of about 20,000 individual generators, and also looked at kind of long periods of weathers, like we actually simulated 6 weather years to address some of the questions. And we essentially modeled kind of two scenarios, because the first question we get after we show the cost reductions is that, fantastic, if the cost reductions have happened, why are we bothering to do the analysis? Would the power sector kind of clean up itself? And that's the first scenario we run. We basically say what there's a no new policy case, meaning that what if no new policies are implemented and the PTC and ITC expire? And what we find, and this is shown on the right-hand side of this slide, what we find is that the clean energy share, especially solar and wind, does not increase significantly. It increases by a modest amount, even despite all the cost reductions. And here is a simple explanation for that, is US electricity demand is not growing that rapidly. And most of the gas asset that is there is already built. And we are under a very low kind of natural gas price regime, which is likely to stay. So essentially, renewable plus storage have to compete with just the going forward cost of natural gas, which is like 2 cents. And because natural gas is not paying for its environmental damage costs, basically GHG and air pollution, that's kind of an unfair competition, which leads to renewables energy not dramatically kind of taking over the power sector without new policies. And then we essentially modeled, this is a very important point, because we see a lot of kind of excitement, which is great, that, oh, renewable costs have come down and it's competing with gas. And that's true, but we believe that without additional policy, the system is not going to clean up itself. That's a key finding of our analysis. Then we modeled a policy case, which is basically a 90% clean energy standard by 2035. And clean energy means it also includes hydro and nuclear. So it's about, and we asked the model, okay, what's the least cost pathway to get to 90% clean? And there is no surprise there. It's essentially solar, wind, and it kind of continues to hold on to the hydro and nuclear generation that is already there, plus some planned retirements. The key point here is that gas plays some role. Like, for example, the 10% of generation still comes from gas power plants. But the gas generation from its original amount is reduced by 70%. Next slide. So the second question that we get asked is, what about those weeks of really low wind output or kind of reduced solar output? How would the grid be balanced? And this is where we run a simulation in Plexos, look at each of the 134 zones in the US, looking at the kind of the transmission constraints. And here's kind of the bottom line, how the grid is balanced. Essentially, we find that we conduct like a 7 weather year simulation, and we do find that wind generation drops significantly. So for example, wind generation drops as much as like 70 to 80% of its average output. And in the days with the highest kind of residual demand, the system is balanced by essentially 150 gigawatts of batteries, which we find cost effective, or deployment, plus hydro, plus nuclear, and about 350 gigawatt of existing gas capacity. That plays a significant role in balancing the grid. And this is a conservative approach because we have not really considered demand response and other options that we will consider in subsequent studies. But that 350 gigawatt of gas balancing capacity is kind of a conservative estimate. In reality, it's going to be much lower because you could do a lot with like at least 50, 60 gigawatts of demand response and other things. Interestingly, this gas capacity, which is already built, does play an important role in balancing the system when renewable output decreases significantly. I call it like the brilliant babysitter, which is already paid for. I think we should use it until we find a cheaper alternative and get on with decarbonization. So that's the second question we get in terms of reliability, and we do some assessment on that. Next slide. this is the result that we are most excited about. What we show is that we modeled the wholesale electricity cost. Now, the wholesale electricity cost essentially includes the generation cost plus the incremental transmission cost. And what we find is that given the dramatic cost declines, and given we are using gas as babysitter, what we find is the wholesale cost of a 90% clean electricity system will be about 10% lower than today, which is very exciting, because you could argue that you could reach 90% clean electricity or almost decarbonize the power sector without increasing consumer bills or consumer costs. As you can see that this 90% clean electricity is slightly more expensive than our counterfactual case, which basically is dominated by gas. But that counterfactual case doesn't take into account the environmental damage of the fossil-based energy system. And we take that into account, and which is what is shown on the left-hand side of the figure, which includes the environmental costs. Those environmental costs are about 1.5 to 2 cents per kWh. These are basically climate and air pollution damage costs. And we see that the 90% clean energy power system is overwhelmingly cheaper. So the bottom line is we can do 90% clean electricity system without increasing consumer cost, which is very, very exciting. Next slide. There are significant environmental benefits. And as you can see, most of the SOx and NOx emissions are eliminated in the 90% case. And if you count all the benefits, we avoid about $1.2 trillion worth of environmental and health damages by moving to a 90% clean electricity system. Next slide. We argue that this is doable. And there are a couple of reasons that the renewable electricity built out that you see is not 10x of what we are doing today. And it also provides, like, for example, the renewable electricity has gotten so inexpensive in terms of capital cost that it's not that only the Sun Belt and the windy places in the US can only build renewable electricity, but it's become ubiquitously cheap. So there are more geographic areas where you can do a faster build out. And we have heard from industry that they think 10x is challenging, but increasing the pace to 2 to 3x is not, it's not insurmountable. And this is what we have to do. And it provides an incredible economic stimulus opportunity in the context of COVID to basically absorb $1.7 trillion worth of clean electricity or clean energy investment without increasing consumer bills. Next slide. And Taylor, this is where you take over.
Yeah, sure. Great, thanks, Amol. So, as Amol mentioned, this opportunity to vastly expand the power sector and invest in what ends up being about 1,000 new gigawatts of wind, solar, and storage over the 15 years is an excellent stimulus opportunity and a really powerful employment opportunity. So we similarly ran an employment analysis, using an industry standard model. And what we find is that our clean energy, our 90% clean scenario actually supports 500,000 more jobs per year through the study period compared to that business as usual scenario. So we find that, our 90% clean scenario, because we're building so much new wind, solar, and battery storage, over the course of 15 years, that system actually relies on about 30 million job years, which is just a metric of holding a job for 1 year. Compare that to the business as usual, where we're sort of ticking along, maintaining existing gas capacity, not building a ton new wind and solar. That system only relies on about 20 million job years over the 15-year period. So this massive investment in the power sector supports a ton of new jobs, despite the fact that we'll be retiring the coal fleet over 15 years and eliminating those employment opportunities. We'll be building so much new wind, solar, and storage that it's actually a net job gain for us. And as we'll mention, sort of in the policy sector, this is sort of an upper bounds estimate. So there are policy tools to ensure that these jobs actually get created, that they're actually good paying jobs, that they're supporting living wages and spread throughout the country. So as Amol mentioned, and obviously as is kind of top of mind, in the midst of COVID and sort of in the midst of leading up to the election, we think that this 90% or even 100% clean electricity grid is a really powerful stimulus opportunity. So we know that it can sort of empower economic recovery through new jobs and through new infrastructure. And we know it won't hurt people's pocketbooks because wholesale electricity costs actually fall under our 90% clean case. So a little more specifically, as I mentioned, Energy Innovation has a supporting policy paper as an accompanying this report, and it lists a whole slew of detailed suggestions and recommendations for policymakers at every level to capture some of these benefits that we talked about. Paramount to all those, sort of the top line policy recommendation is the idea that a national clean energy standard is the most effective and most efficient way for us to achieve this goal. So we know that without policy intervention, we can't achieve this. As Amol showed on that first slide, the no new policy scenario really only achieves about 55% clean energy compared to our 90% clean electricity sector. So what we begin to recommend is a national clean energy standard with a set of binding goals over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and then eventually a 100% clean electricity standard. Obviously, this has been somewhat superseded. We released this report just a few weeks before the Biden administration released their energy and climate plan, which now calls for 100% clean electricity by 2035. I'm sure there will be questions about that. Amol and the team just released a getting to 100 brief after some research just a couple weeks ago. So we can talk about sort of bridging that gap. But essentially, as we know, investment and tax credits, the ITC and the PTC will not do it alone, which is why we call for this clean energy standard. Some additional policy levers that are highlighted in the report are really ways to, are all sort of policies to both ensure that this, 1,000 gigawatts of new wind, solar, and storage and supporting transmission investment is built and is easy to build across the country, and that lots of those jobs and the net job gains that we quantify that I mentioned in a couple slides ago are actually deployed in the U.S. And are actually good paying and supporting communities. So some ways to do that are reinstating the advanced manufacturing tax credit, basically a tax credit to ensure that the manufacturing of all these new generating technologies occurs in the U.S. This was a really powerful tool following the 2008 financial crisis and helped support a lot of manufacturing boom following the stimulus bill. Additionally, we talk a lot in this paper and in the policy paper about supporting the transition and ensuring that we avoid stranded assets, stranded investments in gas assets that won't be used or will have to be shut down early, and also supporting the early retirement of coal plants. In our modeling, all coal is retired by 2035, and we build no new gas plants. Which means that utilities who want to retire these coal plants early, coal plants that are right now scheduled to run in the 2040s and 2050s, will probably need some new financing mechanisms to make that happen. One popular tool is securitization, which is legislation enabled, but there's opportunities for federal and state governments to offer financing to help sort of reduce the impact of retiring those investments early. And then, of course, ensuring that this transition, doesn't leave too many folks behind is making sure that we take care of coal communities, mining communities, communities that depend on a single coal plant for local tax revenue, or even the majority of jobs. We have a series of recommendations, all around supporting workers' retirement through fully funded pensions and healthcare obligations, as well as even, suggestions like direct payments in lieu of local tax payments. And then finally, as I mentioned, this build out of clean power is dramatic, but as we state, pretty feasible. It amounts to about 60 or 70 gigawatts of new wind and solar built every year for the next 15 years. We're in our policy recommendations, we call on the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior to sort of work together to streamline some of that permitting, ensure that transmission gets built, ensure that both inter and intrastate transmission gets built, and that it's easier to site and appropriate develop these clean energy resources. So with that, Mol, I don't know if you had anything to add at the end, but if not, we can just open it up to questions.
Oh, I think we let's just open up to questions.
Great.
Okay, great. So maybe I can ask my question first, and then we move to the questions from the participants. So to get from 90% clean grid to 100% clean grid in 2045, you mentioned that there is investment in research needed. Like, what exactly is going to be needed? Because we wouldn't be relying on this gas power plants anymore. What is going to be the missing piece there?
Yeah, so we just, in fact, I just shared in the chat an analysis we produced to look at what are the options for the last 10%. And from a policy perspective, here's kind of at least my take, is that we have shown that using commercially available technology today, you can reach 90% clean and reduce costs. So I think it's pretty apt to set a 100% clean electricity target, not by 2045, but 2035, because we do have 10 years to kind of develop those technologies and maybe deploy them kind of post 2030. So here are kind of 4 options we looked at for the last 10%. 3 of those options kind of rely on green hydrogen from electrolysis. And what the cool thing is that we do find significant curtailment in our 90% clean electricity scenario, and we don't value it. So there's an opportunity to use some of that curtailed electricity to really produce hydrogen pretty cost effectively. The cost of electrolyzers is coming down significantly. So once you have the green hydrogen at about $2 per kg, there are kind of 3 options to use that. What's interesting is that in terms of fuel cells, the cost of stationary fuel cells is pretty high, like $1,000 to $2,000 per kilowatt, and they are capable of running for many hours. What we are finding interesting is the cost of auto fuel cells are 1/10 of that. The trick being that so they're about $100 per kW, but their life is, in terms of durability, is not that long. But for that last 10%, we don't need that kind of life. So we have that option. We do have options related to using hydrogen in modified gas turbines, which essentially GE offers several of their turbines which can be modified to run hydrogen. So, and essentially, you could also do kind of mix that hydrogen with carbon dioxide to make synthetic methane and run it in existing gas turbines. And there are other 2 options, which are basically CCS, and direct air capture. So we believe that there is plenty of innovation once you actually set a policy goal, and most likely we're going to be wrong. There might be some solution that we have not thought about. I don't know what exact technology. There is some long duration storage PPA being signed. I don't know what the technology is, so I hope once the policy is in place, the solutions will come, maybe from some folks from this group.
That's very interesting that clean hydrogen is in the center of this. I did not expect that. Okay, a question from Zach Subin. It sounds like you didn't assume much load growth. Have you considered whether a new gas might be needed with high levels of electrification to reach the same 90% clean level?
Yeah, we did run a high electrification scenario and kind of applied the same constraints. Interestingly, actually, the cost of a 90% clean electricity comes down with load growth through electrification because we are getting better utilization of some of the generation and transmission assets. So we did run that scenario.
Okay, question from Riza Talia. For the net gain in jobs, did you estimate the average income per job and are the new jobs compare apples to the postal jobs?
Yeah, good question.
So we relocation and all of those training costs.
Yeah, good question. So we don't. In the analysis, we don't necessarily, in the model itself, we don't necessarily consider sort of the quality of the job. So we make some assumptions about which jobs are unionized, which jobs aren't, but there's sort of broad swath generalizations, a national look. So they're not really detailed in terms of how much all those employees are making or how much each sector is making, for example. We do have sort of a more detailed breakdown around where the job shifts. So we obviously see a kind of huge proliferation in construction and operations jobs, or sort of construction and maintenance jobs, and kind of a turn from the traditional oil, gas, and coal dominated jobs that are might be related to mining or operating and fixing those plants. And that's basically because wind, solar, and storage jobs, they typically take a lot of people to build and then a lot less people to run. So there are certainly some trade-offs that need to be considered when we make this transition. We also have measured sort of what are called induced jobs, which are kind of the impact of lower electric bills and cheaper power, as well as increased spending in these communities and kind of increased investment. So we know that such a large investment and opportunity provides other economic gains. But kind of, as I said, and as I highlighted in the policy paper, there's a lot of work to be done to ensure that these economic and employment benefits are actually realized. And that's ensuring that if we do, create 100% clean energy standard, that we're also creating, unionization requirements or a minimum wage, other policies like that to support good employment opportunities.
Another question from Riza on the dependable without coal or new gas slide. Hydropower seems to be very dynamic. Does excess runoff water from ice melting during the spring severely affect hydro's ability to be curtailed if needed?
Yeah, we do consider a lot of these constraints while modeling hydro generation, and you can see that hydro does play a role, but fairly modest role. And we basically look at historical data and look at kind of extreme dry hydro years to see how much is run of the river and how much is dispatchable. And only dispatch the portion that is dispatchable.
Okay, another question from Steve Bissell. Have you studied Clean Peak RPS as a means to get to the National Clean Energy Standard?
It's a good question. So there's not that many good examples of Clean Peak standards in the U.S. I think Massachusetts has one. I mean, for those who don't know, a Clean Peak standard is basically a standard that is sort of halfway to a clean energy standard. It basically requires those generation companies to sort of meet the highest peak hours of demand with clean power. Typically, when demand spikes in, like we saw in California during those hottest days when we had to turn off power, those peak periods are also usually supplied by the dirtiest power sources. I think it's an interesting idea. I don't think it's actually been proven out yet. There have been some criticisms of the plans that have operated in other states like Massachusetts that they're not actually reducing overall carbon emissions because they do sort of funky things around when the batteries charge and when they discharge. So I think there's opportunity in a Clean Peak standard. I think one of the sort of underlying premises of the results that we have in the 2035 report is that a general clean energy standard is a pretty simple and pretty clean-cut way to cut carbon emissions from the power sector. That obviously has sort of broader implications around peaker plants and plants that are operating in disadvantaged communities more often, things like that. But broadly speaking, like we think that a clean energy standard is sort of the quickest, cleanest, most efficient way, as opposed to relying on various other kind of specific peak standards or things like that.
Another question from Doug: how much, if any, new transmission is built?
Okay, so what we find is that we find about, I think, $60 to $100 billion worth of new transmission investments required. But most of those transmission investments are required what we call in spur lines, which connects the remote renewable resource to the load center or the nearest transmission line. And so I would argue that this study is not saying that there is no need for more economical transmission. What it's saying is that most of the transmission required is in spur lines, and we show a pathway to reach 90% clean while primarily relying on spur line transmission and not needing huge upgrades to the bulk transmission system. I would take those results with a pinch of salt because this is not a transmission study. That being said, I would say there are a couple of fundamental reasons why we might see much less transmission built out than if we did the study a few years ago. So basically what has happened is that the capital cost of solar and wind has dropped so much that the gain from building a long transmission line and getting power from a wind or solar resource, which is say 30% better. When the solar and wind prices were 10 cents, I would save 3 cents. So it might be worth building that transmission line to save that 3 cents. But when the solar and wind prices are 2 cents, a 30% better resource is going to save you less than a cent. And at that point, essentially the arbitrage between transmission and higher quality resource doesn't pan out it used to pan out 10 years ago. And also storage provides, so there is more competition for transmission built out. That being said, I think a more rigorous assessment is needed to figure out what economical transmission, if there are any major economical transmission projects that make sense. But if somebody says that, like there were a previous study which showed that in order to get to 90%, you basically had to build huge inter-regional bulk transmission lines, and that's why 90% clean was not feasible, because you can never really build that kind of transmission. That's no longer true. Okay, so
a question from Nora Hennings from YPE. Did you include any assumptions around DERs as part of the deployment, or was it all assumed to be utility scale projects? This is also a question from me. I'm also curious about this.
Sure. Yeah, we, the results of the modeling are largely focused on utility scale. There's a small built-in assumption into the model around how much distributed solar gets built. It's pretty negligible, something like 60 or 70 gigawatts. So we don't make any real assumptions about DER adoption. We sort of rely on essentially a business as usual. With that being said, as we mentioned, kind of talking about the results, we know there's really great opportunity for DER to possibly make this transition even easier. One thing Amol mentioned, sort of showing that that 1 week of heavy gas use, is that we rely on 360 gigawatts of gas to hang around for most of the year, and be largely available for those times when wind and solar generation drop dramatically. We know that something like 70 or so gigawatts of that 360 gigawatts of gas operates less than 1% of the time, which means there's really great opportunity for other distributed technologies and other demand side technologies to take the place of those gas plants that are just hanging around. So distributed storage, behind the meter PV and storage, other demand side technologies like flexible load or demand response. Those are all opportunities on the demand side that we didn't really look at. So I think if we were to do this again and sort of take a more robust look at the distribution system, we would probably have some really interesting results, and it might even be cheaper and easier to achieve.
Well, that's great. Another question, what does the model assume for percentage of utility scale versus distributed solar over time? What about energy storage? Well, that's kind of a similar question. How does this factor into the overall LCOE for solar and hybrid resources? Kind of a similar.
Really similar. Basically the distributed PV kind of assumption is just plugged into the beginning of the model. Amol, correct me if I'm wrong, but REIDS basically treats distributed solar as a decrement to load. And it kind of makes no big assumptions that distributed solar is going to grow. So as I mentioned, the 99% of the solar that is built is utility scale, and just a very small amount of distributed.
Yeah, and as far as the hybrid question is concerned, essentially, we find about 150 gigawatts of battery storage to be cost effective in the mix. So that's kind of the scale. We don't specifically model co-located hybrid projects, although they offer significant saving potential because you're sharing many things, including inverters and space. But we don't model. In fact, so I think the way to look at this analysis, it kind of is a conservative estimate of what is needed to kind of an upper bound on costs and what's a possible upper bound on costs. But then if you have DER, if you further optimize transmission, if you co-locate storage with grid scale renewables, all will kind of ease the transition and further reduce the cost.
A question from Stephanie Christensen. How far back and how many years of historical data did you base the scenarios on?
I might answer this inaccurately. I don't fully understand the question, but I'll just attempt anyways. So basically, we looked at 7 weather years to kind of simulate, because if we just run a simulation for 1 year, it's not going to capture some of the extreme events. So we looked at kind of 7 years of hourly weather data. We also kind of looked at how would that analysis change if we looked at like 35 years. And we find, we don't find a huge difference between 7 years and 35 years. But so we did look at 7 years of weather data. Was that the question? In terms of historical data?
I think so. I think this is, that is the data you use. And the prices of solar and storage is pretty much all there online.
Yes.
And for all of the years that they exist. A question from Zach. Did you use the 2016 EPA social cost of carbon?
So we take basically a blended social cost of carbon value. It's almost equivalent to the 2016 EPA, but we sort of relied on kind of some more nonpartisan values. So there's a couple values from the literature, and we basically blend them together. So it's about $50 a ton, and that's the value that we rely on.
And just to be clear, in our main case, we do not include. So when I'm showing you the cost of 90% clean system or the benefits of it, we are not including air pollution and carbon costs. So this is, so on the right-hand side, when we are showing the results, this figure basically shows cost without environmental costs. And on the left-hand side, it shows including environmental cost. And I do agree that whatever carbon estimates we are using are too low. First of all, it's not real societal cost of carbon because it is basically cost to the US. If you look at some of the recent work by Ken Caldera and others, they show that the societal cost of carbon is $500, out of which $50 to $80 falls on the US. So anyways, I think that the cost of carbon used is too low.
Mm-hmm. And does this social cost also include healthcare costs that you're referring to?
Yes, it does. I mean, healthcare costs related to air pollution damage. There is new research by some economists which now include some of the increased mortality costs from climate change, and those are not included. There were some recent testimonies in Congress which include those.
Mm-hmm. So as a foreigner, I'm somewhat familiar with like how policy works and how policy changes work. But can you, in kind of a simple terms, explain to me if there is no increase in cost to the consumer and the electricity is not more expensive? There is policy changes. Are there incentives that pay for this project and that help pay for this project, or is it paid by like companies who need to comply with this clean standard? It might sound.
So you're asking about basically in practice how a clean energy standard would sort of force this to happen.
Yeah, who will pay for this at the end if it's not the consumer?
Yeah, so I mean, in the end, there's a few ways depending on how a clean energy standard is structured. Largely, what a clean energy standard does is it will force power generation companies, so independent power producers, utilities, plant operators, to continuously comply with a generation set. That essentially means that they'll have to continue investing in zero carbon or low carbon resources and continuing to replace existing high emitting resources. So in practicality, the way that would work, it probably is a little complicated. You know, most of the country is served by wholesale electricity markets, so RTOs or ISOs. It's possible that individual RTOs and ISOs could actually price those standards into their values such that every year it would get increasingly more expensive to dispatch your gas plant or your coal plant, which would sort of slowly force a power generation company to draw down the emitting resources and reinvest in clean resources. But in terms of who sort of shares the cost burden, I mean, we call this a stimulus opportunity. We call this kind of an investment opportunity because it means that we'll need companies of all sorts putting capital dollars into, hundreds of gigawatts of new power every year. Because solar and wind is so cheap to build, that means that companies will be spending, lots of money, borrowing lots of money to build those plants, but it won't be materially, it won't materially trickle down into like an individual consumer's electric bill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that is what we are actually showing when we are showing the wholesale cost. These are kind of the cost to consumer, like wholesale cost to consumer. You have to add the transmission and distribution cost. But essentially, if you put a clean energy standard, nothing really changes from a consumer perspective because this stuff is pretty well worked out in the utility rate making, that once you have a clean energy standard, utilities have to procure X% of renewable electricity. They sign power purchase agreements to buy those on per kWh basis. Based on those power purchase agreements, private financiers go into the capital markets, raise a bunch of money. It's a pretty well-oiled system in terms of raising capital once you have a policy in place.
Yeah, and one sort of finer point on that, which I think is really important and not, I'm sure, lots of YPE people understand this, but I don't think the general public sort of understands this, which is the fact that utilities and power generation companies make money by spending more, essentially. They make money by building things. So every utility in the company has an obligation to serve its customers. And in granting that obligation, they are also given the opportunity to earn a rate of return on every capital investment dollar they spend. So regulatory commissions say that you're going to have to invest in your electric grid, you're going to have to build substations, you're going to have to build new solar farms, and we'll let you spend all that money and actually earn a small rate of return on that. That's, again, all sort of built into the utility rate making formula, and that's what eventually trickles down into how much you pay on your electric bill.
Thank you. Another question from Nora from YPE. One of the early slides showed coal generation increasing in the no new policy scenario. Were there key factors that drove that increase in coal rather than natural gas?
Yeah, that is just an artifact of the model. We use the annual energy outlook projections of coal and natural gas prices, and they tend to be more conservative on natural gas and more aggressive on coal. I don't know the reason, but what we did was we ran alternative scenarios, and we have a data explorer where you can, if you actually use NYMX natural gas prices, which we think actually are more closer to what's going to happen, then the coal generation kind of goes out on its own, even in no new policy case. So, so it's really a function of natural gas price and relative price of natural gas.
Yeah, so as Amol mentioned, if you go to 2035report.com, you can play with our data explorer and you can toggle on different variables and whatnot. including sort of different gas prices. I think if we use, you know, the updated AEO projections, this probably won't happen, but yeah, largely an artifact of some funky gas projections.
Another question from Nora. You mentioned that Biden's plan came out shortly after the report. Did the Biden team coordinate with your team at all? And how might does his plan align with your findings?
That's a happy hour question, so I'm not going to take that away.
Yeah, I guess the short answer is that there were tons of people working on this report, tons of people who are sort of close to the policy and politics space. But no, there was no sort of formal coordination with the campaign or advisors or anything.
Yet. Maybe there will be soon. I have a kind of a related question. I went to a Project Drawdown talk several years ago, and they created this proposal, and then went to politicians to kind of work with them to try to have these policies adopted. What are the next steps for 2035 report? Are you going to try to make it become reality, and how is that going to happen?
Vote, get more people to vote.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. I think there's a million things that we can do to sort of make this a reality. Amol has probably said the most paramount. But beyond that, I mean, I think utilities around the country are sort of recognizing that this is reality. There are lots of powerful power producers who have sort of recognized this and adopted this strategy that like they can be a part of the 1,000 new gigawatts of wind and solar that are being built. And there are others who have not quite recognized that you can't really be building gas plants today if we want to solve climate change. So if a utility comes out and suggests that they believe the science and that they plan to be net zero by 2050, if they are building gas plants today or in the next 10 years, you're going to want to question that on its face. And that's a very powerful sort of point to target for advocates at the state level or for regulators at the state and regional level. So there are lots of ways that this sort of idea can be tackled in all sorts of venues, all sorts of regulatory and state venues. The easiest way to accomplish it, as we said, is a federal government that installs a national binding clean energy standard. But it doesn't mean that there aren't levers to pull at sort of more localized and regional state levels.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think in addition to, so at the federal level, essentially you have the clean energy standard, but also arguing for continuation of PTC and like the incentives for renewables is critical, because the argument that is made is that, oh, renewable costs have dropped and they don't no longer need incentives. I think that argument needs to be reframed, saying that renewables need to have incentives to actually have a level playing field with natural gas, because natural gas is not paying for its climate damage. And as Taylor said, that it's pretty important because there's so many decisions that are being done at the state legislature, the CPUC. This is where I think a group like this is very important, that I'm sure you're working in consulting companies or with regulators to make the case that the stuff is very close. I mean, what the tragic part about this is that just like a few weeks ago, I was kind of going for a run on that ominous Wednesday where you couldn't like see the light at 9:30 a.m. And I was wondering, like, we are letting the planet die in vain. See, 10 years ago, we had the goddamn argument, okay, renewables are expensive. There are 15 cents, 20 cents. So we are, killing the planet because we actually want cheap electricity. but now we actually can have cheap electricity. So we just do this group who are kind of young and dynamic professionals that let's not kill the planet in vain, because we are showing we will actually do that because the costs are cheap enough even for clean.
Well, thank you. That's very inspiring. Okay, so I think we are kind of coming to an end of our time, but there is one more question from Chris. How would Taylor and Amol advise Congress to set the ITC and PTC percentage duration, etc.?
I would just do
Good
like
question.
once basically figure out what's the environmental damage cost of natural gas. They are about anywhere between 2 to 4 cents. Well, 4 cents will be too much, but basically until you have carbon tax, which doesn't look politically feasible, have cents per kWh, 2 cents per kWh direct pay to kind of begin leveling the field, and do it for 10 years and not really reduce it. Because here's what will happen is that, yes, people will argue that the cost of renewables will come down, so you don't need as much subsidy. But what happens as renewable penetration increases, the value of renewables to the grid also starts dropping unless you have storage. So that's why I think a clean policy, 2 cents per kWh PTC for next 10 years, that will lead to massive benefits. But I don't know what Taylor, you think.
No, I think the most important thing is that you, I would probably just continue it at current levels, like Amol said, for the next 10 years, and potentially transfer it into kind of more direct cash payments instead of relying on kind of a complicated tax structure, which leaves it somewhat unattainable for some projects.
Okay, thank you. Believe it or not, we reached the end of our endless question stream. Thank you so much for the talk. It was super interesting, a lot of information, and inspiring that this can actually happen. So thank you.